Hi, hello, and welcome to my video presentation for the MTD Final Portfolio Show. My name is James Wetmore, and today I'm going to be showing you a song that I produced, mixed, and mastered that is on my upcoming EP. I played all the instruments on the track, and all the audio was recorded here in my home studio. Now, with my room not being designed for audio recording, there are going to be some complications along the way. These arise from the room being pretty much a square with carpeted floors and thin walls. I've tried to minimize this effect by creating as many odd angles as I can in the room, as well as using gates on the kicks and snares. What I'm hoping to show with this presentation are my skills as a songwriter, producer, and engineer, but first, here's a little bit about me. I grew up in Abbotsford, pretty isolated in terms of musical expression, as I only knew a handful of people who shared my interests. I play many instruments, my mains being drums, bass, and guitar, but also dabbling in vocals. I released music under the name More, all caps, and this song I'm going to be showing you is from my 4-song EP that I'm hoping to put out next month. I recorded this EP entirely in my room with only 6 mics and my DI, so I had to get creative with how I use the space. For my kick and bass amp, I use a Shure Beta 52. For my guitar, snare, vocals, and room mic, I use an Audix i5 or my SM57, X185Bs for the overheads, and a SM58 for the floor tom, all running into my Scarlett 18920 and into Logic. My snare is usually pretty ringy and high-pitched, so I threw an old shirt over to muffle it a little bit, as well as the same on the low tom, as there's usually a lot of low hum. Anyway, here's a snippet of the song I'm going to be showing you. Alright, so here we are in the Logic session of the song that I'm going to be showing you. The first tracks I'm going to be showing are the guitar tracks, which I have grouped into verse, chorus, bridge, and the 2 solo parts. Let's start with the verse guitar tracks. In this stack there are 4 separate guitar parts, 2 playing the main riff, and then 2 playing some atmospheric parts. I wanted to keep the sound raw for these guitars, so I did minimal EQing and some compression with a high attack just to grab any of the big transients that come through. I added some big room reverb to both parts, with the right channel getting a bit more to create space between the two. This would be the standard practice for any of the guitars to come. For the atmospheric parts, more or less the same was done, except not adding compression on the left channel and adding some dotted 16th note echo to give some atmosphere and space to the track. On the mix bus, I added some EQ to take out some mud and some high frequencies that didn't sound good, boosting the high mids a bit to give the guitars a bit more color. I then added some glue compression to make everything fit a bit better with each other. Now let's move to the chorus guitars. There are 3 stacks of guitars, each with a different sound, so to avoid a big mono sound. There's 2 more bassy guitar tracks panned opposite left and right to give a bed to the more MIDI sounding guitar panned almost hard right. I used the setting on my amp to create the differences in tone, as I only had the one guitar set up in standard tuning at the time. I also used different pedals, such as using my big muff fuzz pedal on the right guitar to get more of that buzzsaw-like sound. There's also a high atmospheric guitar playing a descending line to give some melodic motion to the chorus and give it more space. For all the guitars in this section, I had to EQ a lot of high frequencies out of the track that was making a nasty ringing noise. I also used the EQ to shape the sound and add more bass or mid-range where necessary. I then compressed them all by the same amount that I had on the verse guitars, except the high guitar where there is a fast attack and a slow release to allow the transients to drag on. I then compressed them all by the same amount that I had on the verse guitars, except the high guitar where there is a fast attack and a slow release to allow the transients to drag on for longer. After compressing them, some frequencies would come popping back out, so I'd have to go back in and do some subtractive EQing and fix the sound, as well as adding in anything else the track might need, like lower high mids. All the tracks have the same room reverb as on the verse guitars, except there is a bigger difference in the amount being sent across the 3 tracks. This creates a bigger bed for the track as it sounds deeper and wider in the mix. The high guitar also has the dotted 16th note echo that was present on the verse guitars, again to add atmosphere. The mixing of the more bassy sound with the more mid-rangey guitar makes the guitars in total sound way more powerful and full, adding a lot of energy to the track that is amplified with the addition of the cleaner 3rd guitar. On the mix bus, I did the same thing as in the verse guitars, taking out any mud that was occurring and also adding some glue compression to tighten the sound up. Moving on to the bridge guitars, these come in with the guitar solo, so I need to have them be far back enough to stay out of the solo's way, but up enough that it provides a nice enough bed for it. I use the same technique as in the chorus guitars, where I have one that is more trebly and one more bassy to give a nice rounded sound overall, turning the left channel down more than the right to free up space for the solo, which is panned left. For both of the guitars, I had the same problem with high frequencies that I was having before, so I did some subtractive EQing to take them out before using the same guitar compression just to keep the sound even while preserving the dynamics somewhat. More subtractive and shaping EQ afterwards to further dial in the tone. Added the room reverb, but more than usual as I wanted the solo to sound as forward in the mix as possible, but also creating a nice bed for the solo to lay across. Onto the solo guitars, the first track has a Leslie on it to give it a lot of motion and start the track off with a unique sound, as well as to help distinguish it from the guitars happening at that moment. I did very minimal compression onto the track to keep the dynamics and to just catch the big transients, and EQing out the low end and pick noise. Some room reverb was then added to give the solo some space and depth in the mix. Onto the other guitar solo, which I added a phaser onto and a buzz to give it movement while also allowing me to decide exactly how much I wanted mixed in with the dry signal. I first used EQ to take out the low end and pick noise, then compressed it quite a bit using the VCA compressor because I quite like the sound and color that it adds. I compressed it this much because I was moving around the neck quite a bit, playing higher and lower notes, the range and volume, so the dynamics were all over the place and it was getting a bit buried sometimes. Another round of subtractive EQing to take out unwanted noise and further shape the sound, then adding the room reverb in just enough that the guitar stays at the front of the mix. I really like in-your-face style bass sounds that are really compressed and slightly distorted, so that's what I was trying to emulate with this bass sound. I have them separated into two tracks because in the chorus there is a synth layer that is layering the bass, so I needed to EQ it separately from the first bass. I used a DI straight to my Focusrite to record because I like the clarity of it, and also the Focusrite's preamp, slightly peaking but not in the red to give it some overdrive right off the bat. I wanted the bass sound to be pretty MIDI, so I took out the lows from around 130 Hz by 3 dB and boosted the high mids at around 1000 Hz by 3 dB to balance it out. This also frees up some space for the kick, vocals, and guitar. I then used a Soft 2 VC76 compressor that I like a lot because when it's pushed it produces a really nice soft distortion that I really like. I then sidechained it to the kick so that the kick has a lot more room in the mix. For the chorus bass track, everything is pretty much the same except the EQ, in which I took out some of the sub to make room for the synth layer. The synth bass layer just adds some more aggressive sub into the song and increases the energy in the chorus. I found a nice preset bass sound on Massive X, then added some noise and increased the low gain to increase that sub further. I really like punchy drum sounds that just pop out of the mix at you, like in the song Snake Charmer by Doyle Bramhall II on his Jelly Cream record. Really in-your-face kind of sound, and that's what I was trying to achieve with this drum mix. I knew before recording that I was going to have to double the kick and the snare with a sample, retaining the original sound to keep the attack and punch of them. I found samples that had a lot of body, filling out the kick and snare, then also adding a sub onto the kick to add more low end into the track, increasing its energy. For the kick and the snare, I used a gate to isolate said sounds. This makes it easier to EQ and compress, as well as tightening up the overall sound of the kit. I then used some subtractive EQ to get rid of any hum that was occurring or any dissonant frequencies, taking the opportunity to increase some of the highs, adding in punchiness and excitement to the track. I also used some punchy compression with an attack around 30 milliseconds and a release around 100 milliseconds on the snare to lengthen out the transients, and used a VCA compressor on the kick, pushed pretty hard to give it a bit of an overdriven, intense energy that really brings out the track. Transient Master also helped bring out the punchiness of the kick and the snare, as well as making each track much more defined in the mix. mix. I added some reverb onto the snare sample as the original already had enough from the overheads and room mic. This also helps gel with the original snare. On said overheads, I used almost the same techniques for both of them, using subtractive EQ just to get rid of any hum and dissonant frequencies before slamming them with the compressor to get a nice full puffy drum sound with clear transients. And then added reverb onto both tracks, just enough to increase its space. I like to slam my room mics with as much compression as possible to get a really aggressive sounding kit that fills up the mix easily. I first did some subtractive EQing, then used glue compression at a ratio of 8:1 with a high threshold to really bring out the transients and get that nice overdriven kind of drum sound. Not too much though, as the track itself is generally not super aggressive. I also originally wanted a crush mic to pick up a bit more of the kick and the toms, but it didn't come out sounding very good, so I've just left it muted. I then pan the tracks in a way that spreads the sound nice and wide across the stereo field, while also giving each separate part a place to shine, and also creating an accurate view of the drum set. On the drum bus, I did some subtractive EQ to take out some mud, and then used some glue compression to tighten the kit up a bit more, as well as bring the transients out a little bit. Moving to the vocals, I've split them up somewhat like the guitars, with a stack of verse, chorus, and bridge vocals. Each vocal track is compressed slightly different from each other, same with EQ, but on each there is usually a dip taken out, around 500 Hz, where there is usually some mud developing. Starting with the chorus vocals, there are 4 tracks here, each playing different parts. We have 2 main lead vocals, a low double, and a high belting part occasionally. The 2 lead vocals are both compressed with a punchy attack and release, but different ratios, as I wanted the one track to have more punch than the other one, increasing its ratio and threshold accordingly. They both have similar EQ but opposite frequency boosts, one getting more high end while the other gets a little less. This lets the 2 sounds be distinct from each other and creates a bigger sounding mix. On one track there's also a de-esser, as some plosives were getting a little out of control. Both have strong room reverb on them to give them a lot of space in the track, while the right track has some parallel distortion on it to add just a little bit of grit to the sound. On the low track, more or less the same story, some subtractive EQ, taking out some highs to enhance the bass tone and the voice, and some strong punchy opto compression to best even out the bass sound and lengthy transients, some reverb added as well for space. On the high belting part, it's a little bit different, same EQ, but with a high mid boost to add some extra excitement in the chorus, and slammed with a compressor to give it a really even sound, and also adding in some overdrive from that compressor. A gate is added on to filter out the noise, then some reverb and parallel distortion to maximize the energy coming from these vocals. On the mix bus, there is the usual subtractive EQ and glue compression, as well as some added echo and chorus to make the sound even wider. Moving on to the verse vocals, most of the work is generally the same method of subtractive EQ and some high mids to increase excitement, same punchy compression but with different ratios to create an even but slightly different tone across the 3 tracks, same parallel distortion on the one track to add some excitement into it. Same thing on the mix bus as well, except not putting any chorus to keep the chorus unique. Same process with the bridge vocals, except here we are using more reverb to fill the sound as much as possible while only using 3 tracks. The same can be said for the mix bus, but the amount of echo is much more than on the other buses, increasing the space given in the track.
Beaches and creams, palm trees and dreams. Beaches and creams, palm trees and dreams. I took some time off just to tell someone off. I took some time off just to tell someone off. I'm looking in a mirror and tell me what you see. Look in a mirror and tell me what you see.
Before I started mastering this song, I wrote down some of the things that I wanted to fix with it. The list I came up with included tightening up the bass, taking out some mud, adding some clarity by increasing the high mids, and widening the mix. The best way I found to master is by using a multi-band technique into a low band, a low mid band, a high mid band, and then a final high band. Mastering this way gives me the greatest ability to really tweak every part of the song, creating a much better final master at the end. On the low band, I put a punchy compressor to try and even out the sound and also give a bit more clarity to the low end. Setting the makeup gain to plus 3 dB to keep it legal. I then wanted to add some excitement, so I put the saturation knob on afterwards to give it that slight edge. I set the panning so that it was almost dead center, giving a lot of room for the other bands to spread out in the mix. The low mids is where most of the mud was coming from, which was clogging up the mix and making everything sound uneven and bloated. Before compressing, I did some subtractive EQ to take some of the said mud out, then did the same compression as on the low end. To add some excitement to the tracks, as well as some clarity, I then put on the Fresh Air plugin from Slate Digital, adding enough mid and high air to open up the track a little, finishing with some EQ to take out some distant frequencies. I then panned this band more to the right to widen the mix up a bit and to spread out across the stereo field and free up a lot of room in the mix. On the high mids, all I was needed was some compression to help tighten the band up and add the clarity that I was looking for. I then panned it towards the left channel for the same reason as the low mids, helping to widen up the mix and make the track sound nice and big. The highs are much the same story, just some compression to balance everything out, then keeping it panned in stereo to further widen the mix and help add some clarity by spreading the sound even further. On the main track, I added some glue compression to tighten all the bands back up with each other, then did some subtractive EQing to take out any distant frequencies or hum, also boosting the highs a little bit, increasing the excitement in the track. I then went through the bands and tried to level them out with the volume faders, turning the lows down -4 dB to keep them from getting too out of control and overpowering, same as the low mids as that's where most of the mud was coming from. I moved the low mids to -2 dB to place more emphasis on the vocals and give them more presence in the track, boosting the highs to +6 dB to brighten the sound overall and also to get more of the cymbals in there. Leveling the track out like this gives it the most clarity while also keeping it as a level as possible, giving each instrument a place in the mix. I then bounced those tracks and brought in the song Boys in the Better Land by Fontaine's DC as my reference track for volume. The limiter I used was the L1 Ultra Maximizer, setting the ceiling to -0.1 dB and moving the dither to 16 bits. Using the reference track, I settled on a -3.5 dB threshold, checking with the ceiling to make sure that I wasn't over-limiting it. After this, I wanted to do a final round of EQ to shape the sound a bit and take out any mud that I was still hearing. I boosted the sub a little bit to give the track a bit more at low end and also boosted the highs again as they'd gotten a little quiet. And here's how it sounds in the end. And that's the full breakdown of my song Haraith, which is on my upcoming 4-song EP. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you'd like more, my website will be up on the screen right now, as well as my SoundCloud page where I release all my music. Again, my name is James Wetmore, and thank you for viewing my presentation. Have a good day.